The restaurant was quiet, its upscale atmosphere more apparent than ever, as the hum of conversation and clink of fine china created a backdrop for an evening that seemed all too ordinary for the wealthy elite dining in the exclusive corner of this city. The windows of the restaurant looked out over the shimmering skyline, casting an orange glow that illuminated the elegantly dressed patrons. At one of the lavish tables sat the Japanese billionaire CEO, his demeanor calm, yet his sharp eyes missed nothing. He was a man used to commanding attention, and this evening, he did just that. The waiter had already served his group, and now, only the quiet clatter of silverware filled the space between his words as he negotiated the next big deal. The business mogul had everything: money, influence, power, and yet, in his world, it was always about control, how much he could exert over others, how much he could bend situations to his will. But there was something about this dinner that felt different. He couldn't quite place it. Behind him, unnoticed, moved a young black woman, Naomi Brooks, her presence almost invisible in the polished environment. Dressed in her uniform, she quietly refilled glasses, cleared plates, and kept her movements swift and graceful. But behind the calm facade, Naomi was keenly aware of the stares, the whispers, the subtle dismissals that always came with the job. This was her third shift this week, and every time she walked through these doors, it felt like the world around her was a different universe. The world of the wealthy, the powerful, where people like her were invisible, seen only when they were needed. As Naomi moved between tables, she noticed the slight, almost imperceptible glances thrown her way, how the CEO's assistants ignored her, or how the group of men at the table sneered as she approached. She didn't flinch. She had learned long ago how to navigate these spaces with a quiet dignity that few would ever truly appreciate. Then it happened. The CEO, Derek Caldwell, leaned back in his chair and looked Naomi directly in the eye, his lips curling into a slight smile that barely masked his condescension. He pointed toward her with a languid gesture, his voice rising above the hum of conversation. "Do you even understand what I'm saying?" he asked, his words dripping with the weight of his privilege. Naomi's heart skipped a beat, not from fear but from a recognition. This was a game she had seen too many times, a game of dominance and disregard. Derek Caldwell didn't think she belonged here. He didn't think she even understood the language of the deals he was making. Naomi held his gaze, standing still, her hand steady as she carried a glass of water to his table. He waved his hand in the air, dismissing her before she even had the chance to answer. "I doubt she even knows what negotiating billions means," he muttered to his colleague, making sure everyone in the room could hear him. Naomi could feel the heat of the moment creeping up her neck, but she didn't react. She didn't need to. She simply walked away, her eyes never leaving his for a second. Her silence was a response in itself, one that Derek would never expect. But what he didn't know was that Naomi understood everything. And soon, he would realize that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most weight. The evening continued in the elegant restaurant, where the tension in the air was palpable, yet unspoken. The wealthy patrons dined with the polished grace that came from years of entitlement, their conversations a mix of business and casual superiority. Derek Caldwell, the billionaire CEO, remained at the center of it all, his voice steady and assured as he made his way through a series of strategic discussions. His words flowed like smooth silk, each syllable dripping with confidence, and yet there was a sense of impatience simmering beneath his controlled exterior. Naomi Brooks, moving silently between tables, observed the scene with a quiet awareness. She had seen this before. The arrogance, the dismissiveness, the unspoken belief that people like her, people of color, people in service, were just temporary fixtures in the background of their power plays. But what Derek didn't realize, what none of them knew, was that Naomi had been quietly studying them all along. Every word spoken, every look exchanged, every subtle judgment that was cast her way. She had been invisible to them, but in reality, she had been taking notes, learning more about the world they lived in than they could ever imagine. It was in the way Derek casually dismissed her, with a flick of his wrist, when she came to refill his water glass. "Make sure we get this deal signed tonight," he told his assistant, not bothering to acknowledge Naomi, who stood just a few feet away, waiting. It was in the way the rest of the room followed suit, as if she didn't exist. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't expect them to see her, not in a place like this, but that was exactly how she wanted it. Her presence was subtle, but her mind was always at work, picking up on things no one else seemed to notice. Derek had no idea what he had just set into motion. Naomi had been waiting for a moment like this, A moment when the weight of their arrogance could no longer go unchecked. As the evening progressed, Derek grew more animated, his voice rising as he spoke about his company's next big merger, a deal worth billions of dollars. The men around him listened attentively, nodding in agreement, as if they were part of a secret club, one Naomi was not welcome to join. She moved through the room with practiced ease, refilling glasses and taking orders, but her mind was elsewhere. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a quiet observer, and what she had witnessed tonight was something that couldn't go unnoticed. As Derek stood up to give a toast, Naomi stopped in her tracks. There was something in the way he spoke, the way he acted, that rubbed her the wrong way. She had seen too much of this behavior. Too many times, people like him thought they could say whatever they wanted, treat others like they were invisible, and get away with it, but not tonight. She could feel it building inside her, a sense of power, not from her position as a server, but from the knowledge that she understood this game better than they did. As Derek raised his glass, ready to make another smug remark, Naomi approached the table, her movements slow but deliberate. She didn't say a word. She simply placed a glass of wine down in front of him, and then turned her gaze directly at him. His eyes met hers, and for the first time that evening, he stopped talking. Naomi wasn't intimidated. She wasn't afraid. She had nothing to prove to him, but she had something to teach him. Without a word, she bent slightly to the side, giving a subtle nod toward his assistant who was speaking into his phone, trying to get a final sign-off on the deal. Naomi knew this deal wasn't going to happen. She knew it wasn't going to happen because Derek had overlooked something critical, something no one else had caught. She knew what was going on, and she wasn't going to let it slide. She stood there, her posture tall, her voice steady and calm. "You might want to double-check your numbers before you sign that," she said, looking Derek squarely in the eye. Her words, though simple, cut through the noise of the room. Everyone paused. Derek's face twisted in confusion, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. Naomi simply smiled, but her eyes remained focused on him. "Double-check your numbers. You might want to take a closer look before it's too late." The silence in the room was deafening as Derek's assistant quickly scrolled through the documents on his tablet. It only took a moment before his eyes widened, and his face turned pale. He looked up at Derek, then back down at the screen, his hands trembling. Derek's confident expression faltered. He had been so sure of his deal. But now, he wasn't so sure at all. Naomi had just exposed a flaw in his strategy that could cost him everything. The room was silent as everyone waited for his next move. But Derek was frozen. Naomi had done it. She had shown him something no one else had noticed, and in that moment, the power had shifted. Derek Caldwell was no longer in control. The room was still, the tension now almost unbearable. Derek Caldwell, the billionaire CEO, sat frozen in his seat, his eyes flicking between Naomi and the assistant who was still holding the tablet, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Naomi's calm, collected demeanor only made the moment more unnerving. She had done something no one expected. Derek, a man who had spent years clawing his way to the top of the corporate world, was suddenly humbled by a single comment from a waitress, a woman he had dismissed as invisible. The silence was broken only by the quiet tapping of keys on the assistant's tablet. Naomi's gaze never wavered. She had seen the numbers, the mistake that no one else had caught, and she knew it was only a matter of time before Derek realized the gravity of the situation. The assistant's face went pale as he quickly skimmed the documents on his screen. He double-checked, then triple-checked, his hands now trembling as his eyes widened. "Mr. Caldwell," the assistant stammered. There's an error. A big one." Derek's expression shifted, from arrogance to shock, as he turned to face Naomi. For the first time that evening, his cool composure faltered. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice tight, barely above a whisper. Naomi didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there, her posture tall and dignified, and let the silence speak for itself. She could see the wheels turning in Derek's mind, the realization dawning slowly. "I don't make mistakes," he muttered, almost to himself, as if trying to convince himself. Naomi didn't flinch. "The numbers don't lie," she said softly. Derek opened his mouth to argue, to defend his pride, but something in Naomi's steady gaze stopped him. She wasn't just another waitress. She wasn't someone to be dismissed. She had the power in this moment, and Derek knew it. The entire room was now focused on him, watching as the once invincible CEO grappled with the truth Naomi had laid bare. His reputation, his deal, his entire empire all hanging by a thread. Naomi had simply pointed out what no one else had been brave enough to see. The assistant quickly pulled up a corrected version of the documents, confirming Naomi's words. Derek let out a sharp breath, his face now a mix of frustration and disbelief. "How did you?" he began but trailed off. Naomi didn't need to explain. She had been quietly observing, learning, and when the moment came, she acted. The tables had turned, the room was still, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Derek, for the first time, felt the sting of his own arrogance. Naomi had not only exposed his oversight but had done so with a grace and confidence that no one had expected from a person in her position. She didn't gloat, didn't flaunt her newfound power. She simply stood her ground, silently demanding the respect that had always been denied to her. "I'll get the correct paperwork over to you right away, Mr. Caldwell," the assistant said, his voice low as he quickly excused himself. The tension in the room didn't ease, but Derek, now visibly rattled, looked back at Naomi, his eyes searching for something, perhaps an apology or an explanation. Naomi didn't offer either. She simply nodded, and without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Derek to stew in the uncomfortable silence of his own prideful downfall. As Naomi moved through the room, she could feel the shift in the air, the weight of the moment, the power she had just taken from the man who had once dismissed her, was tangible. She had exposed him for who he truly was, a man who had thought he could control everything, until one person saw through the veil and made him face the truth. Derek Caldwell's empire, built on arrogance and control, was now just a little more fragile, thanks to the quiet strength of a woman he had once underestimated. The power dynamic had shifted. Naomi had won. And in that victory, she had proven something far more valuable than any business deal. She had shown the world that no one, not even the richest, most powerful person in the room, could escape the consequences of their own actions. The room remained in stunned silence as the reality of what had just unfolded settled in. Derek Caldwell, once the undisputed king of the business world, sat motionless, his face a mixture of disbelief and frustration. The high-powered team he had surrounded himself with, the ones who once hung on every word he said, were now whispering among themselves, casting quick glances at the woman who had just humiliated their leader. Naomi Brooks, standing at the center of it all, seemed to carry an aura of calm amidst the chaos, her posture poised but unwavering. She could feel the eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. She didn't need to. This moment, this quiet victory, was hers. The tension in the room was thick, the kind that could cut through glass. Derek's assistant was still reeling from the discovery Naomi had pointed out the error in the documents that could cost the company millions. The assistant's voice had barely broken through the silence when he muttered the words, "Mr. Caldwell, I didn't see this. This could have cost us everything." The realization hung in the air, and Derek's face flushed with both anger and embarrassment. His pride, once unshakable, was crumbling in front of him. His empire, the one he had built through ruthless negotiations and cold calculations, was now in jeopardy, not because of a competitor or a rival, but because of a single woman who had caught the mistake he had missed. Derek finally spoke, his voice low and tense. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Naomi. "You think you've won, but you've only made things worse for yourself." Naomi didn't respond. She simply gave him a calm, almost indifferent look. She had nothing to prove to him. He had already exposed himself. She turned to walk away, but before she could take her first step, Derek called out again, his voice tinged with a mixture of defiance and fear. "I don't need your help. I'll handle this my way." Naomi stopped, but she didn't turn around. She knew exactly what was happening. Derek was trying to reassert control, to reclaim the power he had lost, but it was already too late. The world was watching. He could say whatever he wanted, but the truth had already been exposed. Naomi had seen it all, how the powerful, the influential, like Derek, were so used to winning that they never even considered the possibility of being wrong. She had come to learn that the most dangerous people in the world weren't the ones who were brash and loud, but those who could control the narrative, twist the truth, and make the rules work in their favor. Derek had thought he could do that, but Naomi had shown him how quickly things could turn around. It wasn't about power or influence anymore. It was about integrity. It was about doing what was right, even when no one was looking. As Naomi left the room, she could feel the weight of the stares, the whispers behind her, but she didn't care. She had proven her point. She had changed the game. And now, Derek Caldwell was left with nothing but his pride and a business deal on the verge of collapsing. The power had shifted in an instant, and there was no going back. Naomi had shown him that sometimes, the quietest voice in the room could be the one that carried the most weight. She had made the richest man in the room realize that no one, no matter how powerful, could escape the consequences of their own actions. The room had shifted, the air thick with tension. Derek Caldwell, the billionaire CEO, sat in silence, still reeling from the blow he had just received. His mind raced, but the reality of the situation began to sink in. Naomi Brooks, the woman he had dismissed as invisible just hours earlier, had exposed a fatal flaw in his deal, a flaw he had overlooked in his rush to secure his next victory. The power dynamic had shifted so quickly, it left Derek struggling to regain control. He sat at the head of the table, but now, for the first time in a long while, he felt small. Naomi, on the other hand, moved through the room with a quiet confidence. She had done something no one had expected. She hadn't shouted or demanded attention. She hadn't tried to flaunt her newfound power. She simply spoke the truth, and in doing so, she had flipped the entire situation on its head. As Naomi continued to move gracefully between tables, her presence was undeniable. No one dared to look away now. The once dismissed waitress had become the focal point of the evening. She wasn't just refilling glasses or serving appetizers anymore, she was the catalyst of a monumental change. Derek's assistant had scrambled to make the necessary corrections, and the business deal that had seemed so certain just hours earlier now hung in the balance. The room, once full of laughter and idle chatter, now buzzed with murmurs of uncertainty. People were watching. Naomi was no longer just a figure in the background, she had become the star of the night. Derek had tried to assert himself, but with every passing minute, he seemed more and more like a man on the defensive. His once assured demeanor was slipping, and no matter how hard he tried to mask his unease, it was clear to everyone in the room that the balance of power had changed. But Naomi didn't care for the spotlight. She wasn't interested in the applause or recognition. She had one thing on her mind: justice. She had seen it all before. The arrogance, the dismissal, the belief that some people were just there to serve, to be overlooked, but not anymore. As Derek stood, trying to salvage what remained of his dignity, Naomi locked eyes with him. She hadn't spoken a word to him directly since her revelation, but in that moment, the power was hers. Derek opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was trapped in his own arrogance, unable to regain the composure he had once so easily commanded. Naomi, on the other hand, remained silent, but her gaze spoke volumes. It was not one of anger, but of quiet confidence. She had shown him that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, could escape the truth. Derek had spent his entire life building an empire on the belief that power came from control. But in the end, it was Naomi's quiet strength that had brought him to his knees. As she walked past him one last time, she did so without a word. She didn't need to say anything more. The message had been delivered. The world had seen it, and Derek knew that this night, this moment, would change everything. His empire had been shaken, not by a rival, not by a competitor, but by a single truth spoken by a woman he had once disregarded. Naomi had shown the world that power wasn't about dominance. It wasn't about money or status. It was about integrity. It was about standing firm, even when the world tried to tell you that you didn't belong. And in that moment, Naomi had won not just the battle, but the war. Derek's empire, built on the belief that he could control everything, had just been exposed for what it truly was: a house of cards. Naomi had taken him down, not by force, but by the quiet power of truth. The silence in the room was deafening. The sound of cutlery clinking against plates had stopped. Even the usual murmur of conversations seemed to fade into nothingness as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Derek Caldwell, the billionaire CEO, who had once dominated the room with his presence, was now reduced to a man staring blankly at the documents that had just betrayed him. He had built an empire from nothing, used to taking down rivals with nothing more than his sharp wit and ruthless tactics. But in that moment, as Naomi stood before him, unwavering, he realized that power was no longer in the hands of the man who controlled the deal. Naomi Brooks had just taken that power from him, effortlessly, without a single threat, without a single raised voice. Derek's eyes flickered between the corrected documents and Naomi, who stood there in front of him, calm and composed. His pride, once a fortress around him, was now crumbling. The realization was crushing. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a humbling blow to everything he had ever believed in. He had underestimated Naomi, and in doing so, had lost everything. Naomi hadn't just pointed out a mistake in the paperwork. She had exposed the fragile nature of his empire. For years, he had made people feel small, like nothing more than pawns in his grand game, but Naomi had flipped the script. Now, Derek was the one feeling small. His empire, built on a foundation of arrogance and control, was showing cracks. Naomi's victory wasn't just in the correction of the numbers. It was in the quiet defiance she had shown, in how she had flipped the power dynamic entirely. For the first time, Derek felt what it was like to be dismissed, to be overlooked, to be treated as though he didn't matter. It was a feeling he had imposed on others countless times. But now, it was his turn. Naomi didn't gloat, didn't seek applause or praise. She didn't need to. She had won, in the most meaningful way possible, by exposing the truth. By making Derek see that no one, no matter how powerful, was immune to the consequences of their actions. As Derek sat there, stewing in his defeat, Naomi quietly moved through the room, once again taking her place as the woman who had just changed everything. Her walk was steady, her gaze unwavering. The whispers in the room followed her, but she paid them no mind. She wasn't here for validation. She wasn't here to prove a point to anyone but herself. She had made a difference, and that was enough. She had shown that people like Derek, people who thought they could control everything, were no different from anyone else. At the end of the day, everyone was vulnerable. And Naomi had just proven that even the most powerful man in the room could be brought to his knees by the truth. Derek, now alone in his thoughts, couldn't help but replay the moment in his mind. He had tried to regain control, tried to brush off the mistake. But Naomi had seen right through him. It wasn't just the deal that he had lost, it was his pride, his sense of invincibility. And now, he had to face the reality that no amount of money or power could shield him from the consequences of his own arrogance. As Naomi made her way to the back of the room, she knew this wasn't the end. Derek might try to salvage his reputation, might try to rebuild what he had lost, but the truth had already been exposed. And truth, once spoken, could never be unheard. Naomi had not just corrected a mistake in a business deal. She had turned the tables, rewritten the rules, and in doing so, had proved that even in a room full of the world's most powerful people, it was the quietest voice that could bring the greatest change. The consequences of Naomi's actions were immediate and undeniable. As the evening wore on, Derek Caldwell, the Billionaire CEO, found himself isolated, both physically and emotionally. The room, once buzzing with animated conversations and business deals, had shifted in tone. The guests, who had been hanging on Derek's every word, were now exchanging nervous glances, their confidence shaken by what they had just witnessed. Naomi had done what no one had expected. She had shown that the emperor was not wearing clothes, and now, Derek was left to face the repercussions. The power he once commanded seemed to slip through his fingers with each passing moment. He had spent years building an empire, but one simple, quiet action from Naomi had exposed the cracks in his carefully constructed world. Naomi, on the other hand, remained steady, unaffected by the chaos she had just sparked. As she moved through the room, she could feel the eyes of the guests on her, but she didn't look for validation. She didn't need to. She had made her point. The deal that Derek had worked so hard to close was no longer his to control. Naomi had inadvertently taken that control from him, not through force, but through the simple act of speaking the truth. The room was silent, except for the hushed whispers of those who had witnessed what had unfolded. They had seen Naomi, a waitress, stand up to the billionaire CEO, and they had watched as he faltered under the weight of her words. This was not just a business deal gone wrong, it was a powerful reminder that no one, no matter how wealthy or influential, was immune to accountability. Derek, once so confident in his ability to control every situation, now felt as though the ground had been ripped from beneath him. He had no choice but to accept the fact that Naomi had outsmarted him. His own assistant had been the first to point out the mistake in the deal, but Naomi had seen it first. She had noticed what no one else had, and in doing so, she had changed everything. She hadn't just corrected a mistake. She had shown Derek that power was never truly in his hands. It had always been an illusion. Naomi had exposed him for what he truly was, just another man, subject to the same rules and realities as anyone else. Derek stood there, trying to regain his composure, but the more he tried to assert control, the more it slipped away from him. He realized, too late, that he had underestimated Naomi, a woman who had been invisible to him up until that point. She had taken that invisibility and used it to her advantage. She had shown him that power doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from integrity, from being able to stand firm in the face of adversity. As Derek continued to stew in his humiliation, Naomi left the room, her head held high. She had not just won a business deal. She had won something far more important. She had shown that even in a world built on wealth and power, the truth could still break through. As Naomi walked out the door, she knew the ripple effects of this moment would be felt long after the evening was over. The world had seen what had happened, and it was clear that things would never be the same. Naomi had rewritten the rules, not with force, but with a quiet strength that Derek could never have anticipated. She had shown him, and the world, that sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is stand their ground and speak the truth. And in that moment, Naomi had not only exposed the flaws in Derek's deal, but she had exposed the cracks in his armor, leaving him to face the consequences of his own actions. As Naomi left the room, the silence that followed her departure spoke volumes. Derek Caldwell sat at the table, his head down, his thoughts swirling. His empire, his carefully constructed world, had been shaken to its core in the most unexpected of ways. The moment Naomi had exposed the flaw in his deal, he had felt the weight of his arrogance crumble. The confidence he had so often relied on to navigate the world had been shattered in an instant. His pride, once unshakable, was now gone, and the guests in the room who had been so eager to bask in his aura of power, now looked at him with a different kind of scrutiny. Naomi had won, not by brute force or intimidation, but by the quiet, steadfast power of truth. The world would never look at Derek Caldwell the same way again. The whispers began almost immediately after Naomi's exit. Guests who had once been eager to please Derek were now exchanging words under their breath, some with disbelief, others with a sense of admiration for Naomi's unexpected victory. Derek was no longer the center of attention, and the power dynamics in the room had been irrevocably altered. The assistant, still recovering from the shock of Naomi's sharp insight, looked up at Derek with a mix of pity and uncertainty. "Mr. Caldwell," he said hesitantly, "I've corrected the documents, but the damage is done. The leak, the publicity, the rumors, it's all going to spread." Derek didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing, calculating the cost of the mistake, the potential fallout. It wasn't just the financial ramifications he was worried about. He knew that this was about something much deeper. His reputation, built on years of dominating the corporate world, was now in jeopardy. And Naomi, a woman he had so easily overlooked, had been the one to bring it all crashing down. The tension in the room mounted as Derek realized he couldn't just sweep this under the rug. The mistakes had been exposed. The public would soon catch wind of the details, and this wasn't a simple slip-up. This was a public humiliation. What he had assumed was a simple dinner meeting, another notch in his belt, had turned into the beginning of the unraveling of his empire. Meanwhile, Naomi was far from concerned with the chaos she had just set in motion. She had done what she came to do. She had not only corrected a mistake that could have cost millions, but she had shown the world that the most powerful people weren't always the loudest or the richest. She had proven that sometimes, standing firm and speaking the truth was more than enough to flip the narrative. Her actions reverberated far beyond the walls of the restaurant. In the coming days, the story of how a waitress had brought a billionaire CEO to his knees would be all over the media. The press couldn't get enough of it, and the hashtag number Naomi Brooks went viral. People all over the world watched as Naomi's quiet strength became a symbol of empowerment. The woman who had once been dismissed as just another waitress was now seen as a hero, a woman who had shown that no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond the reach of accountability. Derek Caldwell, for all his wealth and influence, was left to pick up the pieces. His public image, once pristine, was now tarnished. His company's deal, the one he had so carefully cultivated, was in jeopardy. His reputation, something he had spent decades building, was now a story of caution. Naomi had not only taken away his power in that moment, but had also set in motion the beginning of his downfall. The media, the public, and even his own employees were now questioning him. Naomi had changed everything with a single act of quiet defiance. She had shown that sometimes the truth was the most powerful weapon of all, and that the quietest person in the room could bring the biggest change. Derek knew he would never be able to shake this moment. The world had seen it, and he couldn't erase it. Naomi had exposed the cracks in his empire, and now, the whole world was watching as it began to crumble. As the days passed, Naomi Brooks continued her quiet routine, moving through the motions of life as she always had. But with one significant difference, she had changed the game. Her name had become a symbol of strength and integrity. The story of how she had exposed Derek Caldwell's critical mistake went viral, spreading across news outlets, social media platforms, and corporate boardrooms alike. Naomi had proven that the quietest voices often carried the loudest truths. Derek, on the other hand, had to watch as everything he had built slowly crumbled. His company's stock dropped as the public reacted to the fallout from the failed deal. Investors pulled back, wary of his leadership. The media questioned his judgment, and his reputation, once untouchable, was now tarnished. What stung the most, however, was the realization that the person who had brought him to this point was someone he had once overlooked, someone who had no stake in his world, someone whose job was simply to serve. Naomi hadn't been motivated by money or status. She wasn't seeking fame or recognition. She had simply seen a wrong, pointed it out, and done so without any fanfare. In doing so, she had shown the world that true power doesn't lie in wealth or influence. It lies in doing the right thing, even when the odds are stacked against you. Derek, struggling to regain control, was left with a hard choice: repair his shattered reputation or retreat from the public eye. In the end, he took the latter. He stepped down from his role as CEO, a move that shocked the business world. The company, once a giant in the tech industry, now found itself scrambling for a new leader. As for Naomi, she was offered numerous opportunities in the wake of her quiet triumph. Companies, investors, and even high-profile individuals reached out to her, eager to bring her talents into their fold. But Naomi, true to her character, didn't chase the spotlight. She took a moment to reflect on what she had accomplished and what she truly wanted from her life. She knew the power she had gained was not in titles or money. It was in the ability to stand firm when no one expected it, to be the voice of reason in a room full of noise. Naomi's story became a beacon for those who had been overlooked, who had been told they didn't matter. Her quiet defiance reminded people that strength wasn't about how loud you could be, or how many people followed you. It was about how you carried yourself when the world tried to push you down. She chose to continue her work, this time in a leadership role within a nonprofit organization that focused on empowering underrepresented communities. The same values of integrity and quiet strength that had guided her actions in that high-stakes restaurant were now the foundation of her new mission. Derek Caldwell's empire had crumbled, but Naomi's journey was just beginning. She hadn't just exposed his mistake, she had shown the world that real power was in the courage to be yourself, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As Naomi moved forward, she knew that the impact of that night of her simple but powerful act of speaking the truth would resonate for years to come. Her story would serve as a reminder to everyone who felt powerless, that even in the face of giants, one voice could make a difference. In this compelling Black story, a powerful Japanese billionaire CEO faces a shocking moment of vulnerability when a Black waitress exposes a critical flaw in his multi-million-dollar business deal. As Derek Caldwell, the CEO, arrogantly dismisses Naomi Brooks, the waitress, he soon learns that no one, no matter how powerful, is beyond accountability. Naomi's quiet strength and sharp attention to detail turn the tables, revealing the cracks in his empire. In a room full of influential figures, it is Naomi's calm response that shifts the balance of power, leaving the CEO in a position of deep humiliation. This Black story highlights not only the courage of an overlooked individual, but also the immense power of truth and integrity. Naomi's actions resonate beyond the corporate world, showing that Black stories of resilience, even in the face of systemic power, can lead to profound change. As the billionaire CEO's reputation crumbles and Naomi's life takes a new turn, this Black story serves as a powerful reminder that the most impactful voices can sometimes be the quietest, and those dismissed by society can bring about the greatest shifts in power.